So the MSc in European Public Policy has been around in our department since 2002. In future years, however, it will be known as European Politics and Policy, and that change is made for two reasons. So the first one is really when you think about the European Union these days, you think about politics, you think about politicization, you think about political conflict, and that really makes the European Union a very different beast to study from when I took over the program in 2007. The other reason is really to reflect much better what the program is doing, because the program is very much, on the one hand, about institutions and politics of the European Union and of its member states, and about public policy and policy making on the other hand. So if you look at our three core modules, which the students will study, the first one, called EU Institutions and Politics, looks at the European Union as a political system and asks questions such as, why is the European Union such a different system from, say, its member states? What makes the EU legitimate? Can the European Union be legitimate? How can we explain public opinion on European integration? And of course, what will Brexit do to the European Union as a political system? Our second core module, Policy Making and Regulation Europe, is much more about what the European Union does, how it makes its policies, why its policies are so difficult to reform, and why the European Union is so strong in some areas, think monetary policy, and so weak in others, for example, security and defense. And then we have a third core module, which is called the European Union, Globalization and the State. And that's very much about what happens to countries when they become members of the European Union. Do they change? Why do they change? Why do they change so differently? But also questions, relevant questions such as, is the European Union very much a buffer or a driver of the change coming from globalization and global politics? There are two main things that make the program very special. So the first one is that everyone who comes on the program is really interested in the European Union. But students usually want to study the EU from very different angles, and they can really do that in our department. If they're really interested in international relations, they can study the EU in the world in combination, say, with international trade, international conflict. If they're much more interested in comparative politics, they can focus on British politics or political parties in relation to the European Union. Maybe students are more interested in public policy. Then we've got modules such as public management, for example, or what makes policy work, which are really interesting for students who focus on the policy making in Europe. Or every year, some students are most interested in learning about the normative elements of Europe, the normative questions. And for them, there are modules of political theory, which look at questions such as legitimacy, accountability, and global ethics. The second point I would like to stress is that it's very much a program anchored in political science as a discipline. It's a very rigorous program with a focus on research methods, but it's also really applied and really policy relevant. So we've got, for example, one module called the EU in the World, where students simulate a crisis meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, for example, on Ukraine. This year we looked at Syria, and where the assignments are a policy brief and a simulation or a negotiation brief, and where students are really supposed to understand the dynamics of policy making and negotiation in Europe. So students on the program come from very different backgrounds. To start with, we're not looking for experts on the European Union, and we're not looking for political scientists, but we're looking for students who are curious about both and who want to study the EU systematically and explain the EU systematically. So we're really looking for students who want to read, who want to research, who want to think, and who want to debate the European Union from different perspectives, different methodological approaches, but also different normative ideas, ideas about what the European Union is and where it is going. The UCL is a really great place to study the European Union. If you look at our department, for instance, we've got the Constitution Unit. So everyone who's interested in Brexit from a British perspective have a lot of events going on there, lots of debates, lots of policy relevant publications to read and engage with. We also have a European Institute which hosts UCL's Brexit Hub. and which organises a lot of events around Brexit, publishes a lot of research on Brexit, and gives students a lot of opportunity to engage with events about the European Union, but also its member states. So, for example, on the French elections, the German elections in 2017. So a lot going on at UCL on the European Union, on British politics, and on the EU's member states. I also think London is a great place to study the European Union at the moment, not just in spite of Brexit, but because of Brexit. There's so much going on in terms of events, in terms of political debate, and there's such a great need for expertise on the European Union. The program is a very small program. It's usually very close cohorts with very good relations with our alumni. So former students always join us for alumni drinks at UCL or to talk about Brussels-based careers when we go on our study trip. Where do students go? They go to various careers. So, for instance, they work in the European institutions, in the European Commission, for example. They work for national governments and agencies, for example, for the energy regulator here in London. They go on to the private sector, work for consultancies such as Accenture, for example. Some of them work for NGOs, campaign groups such as InFacts, or for think tanks, including Open Europe, and others go on and follow academic careers and do PhDs. Also, it's obviously really exciting times to study politics, national, European, international. When I started working at UCL, studying the European Union seemed a little bit of a technical exercise. No one says this or claims that anymore. So it's really interesting times to try to explain systematically, to try to understand how the European Union works, why it has become so contested, where we think it is going, and simply how we can explain the political developments at all levels of governance in Europe and the world.